May I buy you a drink? Richard Whitmore leaned down and gently woke the young woman dozing in the worn upholstered seat of the night train. Annie Walker opened her eyes with a start and found a man standing beside her, holding a paper cup. The night train had left Birmingham less than an hour earlier. She tried to ignore the ache along her side, but the pain seemed to be making her increasingly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry. Water," she said. "Just water. That happens to be exactly what I brought." He placed the cup on the small tray before her, careful not to reach across her body. Annie looked up at him, and for several seconds, she forgot the pain. She knew who he was: Richard Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Capital. He's so wealthy that reporters discussed his health as though a bad medical report might shake the stock market. "Mr. Whitmore, right?" she murmured. Richard noticed her stare. "Have we met?" "No. You look as though you recognize me. I've seen your photograph. You appear on the St. Catherine website quite often. That usually means I'm about to hear something unpleasant." He gave a brief smile, then nodded toward the empty seat across the aisle. "Would you mind?" "It isn't my train." Richard sat down. He studied Annie's exhausted face, then glanced at the hand she still held against her side. "You look like you're in quite a bit of pain," he said. "It's going to be a long night. Some hot tea or something from the cafe car might help." Annie lifted the cup and took a small sip. "Thank you, sir. Any better?" "A little. You should probably eat something." "My aunt packed crackers." "She sounds thoughtful." "She would call it suspicious." "Suspicious of what?" "People who ask too many questions." Richard looked surprised, then smiled. "In that case, I should introduce myself before I make things worse. Richard Whitmore. Annie Walker. Nice to meet you, Miss Walker." The conductor entered the car and stopped beside Annie. "Ticket and identification." She pulled up the reservation on her phone. He looked at the screen, then at her. "Atlanta?" "Yes, sir." He checked her identification before handing the phone back. When he reached Richard, he glanced once at the ticket on Richard's screen. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." Then he continued down the aisle. Richard watched him leave. "Does that happen often?" "What?" "People making you prove the same thing twice." Annie slipped the phone into her bag. "Often enough that I don't waste time being surprised anymore." He did not apologize for the conductor, or explain that not everyone behaved that way. Annie valued that silence more than either response. The train rocked gently through the dark Alabama countryside. Most passengers had lowered their shades or reclined their seats. Richard opened his bag and removed 2 packets of salted crackers. "I bought these before I noticed the ones in your backpack," he said. "You'd be helping me if you took one." "Do you always negotiate over crackers?" "Only when the other person looks determined to refuse them." Annie accepted the packet. "Thank you." They ate quietly. The crackers were dry, but they settled her stomach. "What takes you to Atlanta?" Richard asked. "A doctor's appointment." "At St. Catherine?" Annie looked at him. "Why would you guess that?" "The hospital's name is printed on the folder in your bag." She pushed the folder farther inside. "Yes, St. Catherine. I'm going for a post-operative follow-up." Her fingers tightened around the edge of her coat as the dull ache returned. Richard's expression softened. "That is a coincidence. I have an appointment there tomorrow, too." "I know." He raised an eyebrow. Annie corrected herself quickly. "You said people often recognize you." "I didn't say where I was going." She turned toward the window. Her reflection hovered over the darkness outside. Richard let the moment pass. "My flight was canceled because of the storms. By the time my office found another route, this train was the only way to reach Atlanta before morning." "You don't look like someone who usually travels in coach." "I don't. At least you're honest." "I bought the last available seat." "Money can solve many problems, Miss Walker, but apparently it cannot create an empty roomette on a sold-out train." Annie glanced around the aging car. "That must be difficult. I'll try to be brave." A small laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Richard smiled, but his expression changed when he looked down at the cup in his hand. "The hospital is holding an event tomorrow," he said. "Almost a year ago, I received a second chance there through a kidney transplant. They want to hold an anniversary celebration." Annie's fingers closed around the cracker packet. "Congratulations. That's what everyone tells me." "You don't sound happy." "I'm grateful. Gratitude and happiness are not always the same thing." He looked toward the dark window. "For almost a year, strangers have told me how fortunate I am. Doctors, reporters, people at charity dinners. They call it a miracle. But none of them can tell me the name of the person who made it possible. Annie already knew the hospital's answer. They told you the donor wanted to remain anonymous? Richard looked at her. Exactly. And you believe them? I had no reason not to. Annie lowered her eyes to the water. A year earlier, she had been inside St. Catherine too. After surgery, she wrote a letter to the recipient. She did not ask for money, a meeting, or even a name. She only wanted to know whether the transplant had worked. 3 weeks later, the hospital informed her that the recipient did not want contact. She had believed them. You had surgery at St. Catherine? Richard asked. Yes, I had my reasons. She paused. Did you ever try to find the donor? Of course. I've spent the past year living because of someone I've never met. The hospital told me the donor wanted complete privacy and asked me not to search. But I wrote a letter almost every month. They were never delivered. They said the donor was only an anonymous file. What did you write? Richard reached inside his jacket and removed a worn envelope. I tried to say thank you. Then I tried to explain what gratitude means when someone gives you something you can never repay. He turned the envelope in his hands. It sounded like a speech, so I kept revising it. Maybe the donor doesn't need a speech. What do you think they need? Annie met his eyes. To know you didn't waste what they gave you. Richard fell silent. That sounds like something you've thought about. Most people have been given something they didn't earn. He nodded slowly. That's true. He told her the first months after the transplant had been harder than the newspapers suggested. He could not sleep. Food tasted different. His medication had been adjusted more than once. Less than 3 weeks after surgery, he returned to the hospital because his body could not retain enough water. Annie forgot to guard the secret. Did the thirst improve after they changed the dose that afternoon? Richard stopped speaking. The train continued through the darkness, its wheels repeating the same steady rhythm. I never said they changed it that afternoon. Annie folded the empty cracker packet. I've read about transplant recovery. You knew it happened during the 3rd week. That's common. Not the way you said it. His voice held no accusation, which made the question harder to avoid. The overhead speaker crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, our scheduled arrival in Atlanta is approximately 40 minutes from now. Richard glanced at the St. Catherine folder in Annie's backpack, then at the way she still protected her side. You're going to the same hospital, he said. You know details about my recovery that were never made public. And you recognized me before I gave you my name. Annie looked at the cup of water he had brought her. Then she looked at the envelope in his hand. She recognized the firm handwriting. Months earlier, she had caught a brief glimpse of a similar envelope on the transplant coordinator's desk when she went to request help with travel expenses and was quickly turned away. Sometimes, Annie said, her voice unsteady but no longer quiet, the recipients don't want to hide. Sometimes the system doesn't want the two people to meet. Richard held the envelope motionless. Why? Because if they meet, she said, the stories printed in the newspapers may not look as perfect as the hospital wants everyone to believe. Richard stared at her as the train carried them toward Atlanta, toward St. Catherine, and toward a truth someone had spent almost a year keeping apart. Richard still held the envelope in his hand. What stories are you talking about? Annie glanced at the other passengers. Most were asleep, but the narrow coach car made privacy impossible. The kind where the recipient gets a second chance, the doctors receive awards, and the donor disappears from the picture before anyone asks what happened to them afterward. That sounds very specific. It sounds obvious. Not to me. Maybe that's part of the problem. Richard accepted the answer without reacting. Still, something had changed in his expression. This young woman understood more than she should have. She knew details about his recovery that had never appeared in the news, and she spoke about donors with the certainty of someone who had lived through the process. Were you treated at St. Catherine because you donated an organ? He asked. Annie's fingers tightened around the empty cracker wrapper. I told you I had surgery there. That wasn't what I asked, and I'm not required to answer every question you ask. No, you're not. Richard slipped the envelope back inside his jacket. I'm sorry. The apology unsettled her. Instead, he leaned back and gave her enough space to decide whether the conversation would continue. Annie watched the lights of a small town slide past the window. The hospital has rules. Rules against telling me whether you donated. Rules against identifying recipients. Rules against contacting them. Rules against discussing medical details. There were so many papers that by the end, I probably would have signed one promising never to say the word kidney again. Did you have a lawyer? She gave him a tired look. I was 18 and working part-time. What do you think? Richard lowered his eyes. I think that was a careless question. It was an honest one. Honest questions can still be careless. The train leaned into a curve. Annie adjusted her coat and shifted in her seat. What did they tell you before surgery? Richard asked. That I'd be tired for a while. That I might need a few weeks away from work. That they would follow my recovery and help me get to my appointments. And did they? Annie took a drink before answering. They followed the parts they could put in a report. Richard studied her. What does that mean? It means they asked whether I could walk, eat, and sleep. They didn't ask what happened when I missed work. They didn't ask how much the train ticket cost. They didn't ask why I had to postpone school. You postponed college? One semester became 2. Because of the surgery? Because recovery takes time. And time costs money when you're paid by the hour. If you feel for Annie and believe no donor should be forgotten after giving someone else a second chance, please like this video. Then tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because someone near you may be watching Annie's story right alongside you. Richard looked down at his hands. The watch on his wrist could have paid Annie's tuition several times over. For a moment, he seemed embarrassed by it, though Annie knew the watch itself had done nothing wrong. St. Catherine received a substantial donation for donor support, he said. Maybe they supported someone. You didn't receive any help? They gave me a parking voucher once. But you came by train. That was the problem with the parking voucher. Richard nearly smiled, but the expression disappeared. I'm serious. So am I. He took out his phone, then stopped before unlocking it. I could call someone right now. And say what? That a donor is traveling all night in coach because the hospital failed to cover her expenses. You still don't know what I donated. No, but I know enough to ask questions. Annie shook her head. Not tonight. Why? Because people like you make one phone call, and everyone starts cleaning the room before you arrive. I want to know what the room looks like when nobody important is expected. Richard considered her words, then placed the phone face down on the tray. All right. She had not expected him to agree. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Richard broke the silence. You said you wrote to the recipient. Annie looked at him. You said the system sometimes keeps people apart. That sounded personal. I wrote one letter. What did you say? That I hoped the surgery had worked. Nothing else? I didn't know the person. What else was I supposed to say? You could have told them why you did it. I didn't want them to feel responsible for my reasons. Richard's voice softened. What were your reasons? Annie ran her thumb along the rim of the paper cup. A woman in my neighborhood spent years waiting for a transplant. People held fundraisers, brought food, and drove her to appointments. None of it could give her what she really needed. After she died, everyone stopped talking about the waiting list. I didn't. You donated because of her? I registered because of her. I went through with it because someone matched. Richard glanced toward the envelope beneath his jacket as if he could still feel its weight. The hospital told me the donor didn't want any information about my recovery. They told me the recipient didn't want contact. Both statements can't be true. They can if the same person controls both sides of the conversation. Richard's expression hardened, though his anger was not directed at her. Who handled your case? I'm not giving you a name. Why are you protecting them? I'm protecting myself. Those are different things. He nodded. You're right. Annie studied him. Did you really write every month? Almost every month. Sometimes it was one paragraph. Once I wrote 4 pages and threw them away. What stopped you from finding the donor yourself? The hospital said searching would violate their privacy. I had investigators, attorneys, and medical executives I could have called, but using any of them felt like taking something else without permission. His answer surprised her. Most powerful people don't worry much about permission. Most powerful people should worry about it more. The speaker clicked on again, informing passengers that Atlanta would be the next stop. Around them, people began waking, fastening coats, and reaching for their luggage. Richard picked up his bag but remained seated. When we arrive, I'm going to ask St. Catherine why my letters were never delivered. They'll say it was policy. Then I'll ask to see the policy. They'll say it protects the donor. Does it protect you? Annie looked at him but did not answer. Richard rose as the train began to slow. Miss Walker, I won't ask again tonight whether you were my donor. Thank you, but I am going to find out why a hospital that celebrates my recovery seems to have forgotten yours. Annie stood carefully and pulled the backpack over one shoulder. Through the window, the first lights of Atlanta spread across the dark horizon. "Whatever you find," she said, "I think the person who donated to you would be glad to know you wrote those letters." Richard watched her. "And I'm glad your surgery worked," Annie added quietly. For a moment, neither moved. Then the brakes pressed against the rails, and the train began its final approach to the station. Richard had promised not to ask the question again that night, but Annie's choice of words had already given him more of an answer than she realized. The train eased into Atlanta just before dawn. Metal pressed against metal beneath the floor, and the dark windows slowly filled with platform lights, concrete pillars, and tired travelers waiting beneath the station signs. Annie pulled her coat closed and reached for the strap of her backpack. Richard stepped aside to let her enter the aisle first. "Do you have someone meeting you?" he asked. "I can take the bus." "At this hour? It runs at this hour." "That wasn't what I asked." Annie looked at him. "My appointment isn't until 8. I have time." Richard nodded without arguing, though his expression made it clear he did not like the answer. Passengers moved around them, pulling suitcases from overhead racks and checking phones. Annie waited until the aisle cleared before lifting her backpack. Richard reached toward it, then stopped. "May I? I can carry it." "I believe you." He did not touch the bag. Annie appreciated that he had asked, but the weight pulled at her side when she placed the strap over her shoulder. Richard noticed. "My driver will be outside. St. Catherine sent a car. I thought you came by train because your flight was canceled." "I did. Apparently the hospital still believes a car is necessary for the final 2 miles. Then you should use it. There's room for another passenger." Annie adjusted the strap. "I'm not arriving at the donor clinic in a Billionaire's hospital car." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "You said donor clinic." She realized the mistake as soon as the words left her mouth. "I meant the part of the hospital where they handle follow-up appointments." "That is not what you said. You promised not to ask me again tonight." Richard glanced through the window at the pale sky beyond the platform. "It's morning." Annie stared at him. "That was a poor joke," he said. "I won't ask." The doors opened, and cool air entered the car. Annie stepped onto the platform with Richard a few feet behind her. The station smelled of coffee, rain, and the cleaning solution workers had used on the floor. A recorded voice announced another departure while passengers moved toward the main lobby. Richard walked beside Annie without attempting to guide her. "At least let me buy you breakfast. You already bought me water and crackers. I'm beginning to think my generosity has reached its limit. You'll recover." Near the station entrance, a hospital employee in a navy coat stood beside a dark sedan holding a sign that read, "Richard Whitmore." A woman waited next to him. Annie recognized her before Richard spoke. Dr. Margaret Vale wore a charcoal suit beneath a cream overcoat. Her silver blonde hair was fixed neatly behind her ears, and her posture remained straight despite the early hour. She had been the first doctor to shake Annie's hand after the final donor evaluation, and the last one Annie saw before signing the confidentiality agreement. Margaret's attention settled on Richard, and her public smile appeared at once. "Richard, I'm sorry about the flight. We were beginning to think the storm would keep you in Birmingham. The train was comfortable enough." "I doubt that. It was educational." Margaret's smile held until she noticed Annie standing beside him. The change in her face lasted less than a second, but Annie saw it. So did Richard. "Miss Walker," Margaret said. Richard turned toward Annie, then back to Margaret. "You know each other." Margaret recovered quickly. "St. Catherine treats thousands of patients every year. You remembered her name without being introduced." "I have a good memory." Annie shifted the backpack higher on her shoulder. "Good morning, Dr. Vale." Margaret looked at the bag and then at Annie's face. "Your appointment is at 8. The living donor follow-up office uses the east entrance." The words landed before Margaret seemed to realize how much she had said. Richard went still. Annie lowered her eyes. Margaret continued in a controlled tone. "A shuttle can take you there. The administrative car is reserved for Mr. Whitmore." "I wasn't asking for the car," Annie said. "I didn't suggest that you were." The hospital employee beside the sedan glanced from Annie's worn backpack to Richard's leather bag, then reached automatically for Richard's luggage. Richard kept hold of it. "Dr. Vale," he said, "did you just say living donor follow-up?" Margaret looked at him. "That department manages several types of post-operative care." "That wasn't my question. This is not an appropriate place to discuss another patient's medical history." "I'm not asking for her history. I'm asking why you knew which department she was visiting. Margaret's expression tightened. Because I oversee the transplant program. Richard looked at Annie. He did not ask whether she had donated to him. He kept the promise, even with the answer standing close enough to touch. Annie spoke before the silence could grow worse. I need to get to my appointment. Margaret turned toward her. A coordinator will meet you at the east entrance. You should go directly there rather than accompanying Mr. Whitmore to the main building. I wasn't accompanying him. Good. Then there is no misunderstanding. Richard's voice remained even. What misunderstanding are you concerned about? Margaret looked toward the hospital employee and the passengers passing nearby. Richard, the privacy rules exist for a reason. Donors and recipients are not encouraged to establish contact outside approved procedures. Miss Walker and I happened to sit near each other on a public train. And now that you know she participated in our program, the situation should be handled carefully. Richard watched her. You seem very certain about what I know. For the first time, Margaret did not answer immediately. Annie felt the ache along her side return. Though she could no longer tell whether it came from the long ride or the conversation, she looked toward the signs for buses and taxis. I'll find my own way, she said. Richard turned to her. Miss Walker, I'll be fine. A station attendant near the curb was directing passengers toward rideshare pickups. Annie approached him. Excuse me, which bus goes closest to St. Catherine? Before the attendant could answer, he looked at her backpack and said, Employee entrance is on the south side. I'm not an employee. He glanced at her hospital folder. Patient transport? I have an appointment. The attendant pointed toward a bench without apology. Route 16, 10 minutes. Richard had heard the exchange. Margaret had too. Neither spoke until Annie moved toward the bench. Then Richard said, She has been asked to explain who she is 3 times since boarding that train. I haven't been asked once. Margaret's tone remained measured. This is not the moment for a discussion about social assumptions. No, Richard said. It appears this is the moment when those assumptions become convenient. Annie sat on the metal bench and placed the backpack at her feet. She could feel Richard watching her, but she refused to turn around. Margaret lowered her voice. You are here for an anniversary event. The press will attend. This program has spent months preparing. And Miss Walker? She is here for a routine follow-up. Routine enough that she had to sit upright all night because no one paid for her travel? Margaret's eyes shifted toward Annie. Her financial arrangements are confidential. That is becoming a useful word. The Route 16 bus turned the corner at the end of the block. Annie stood and lifted her backpack. Richard took one step toward her, then stopped himself. Miss Walker. She looked back. I meant what I said on the train. I won't ask you for an answer you aren't ready to give. Annie nodded once. But I am going to ask St. Catherine why Dr. Vale knew your name, your department, and exactly how far away from me she wanted you to remain. Margaret's jaw tightened. Annie looked from her to Richard. Then make sure you listen to what they don't say. She boarded the bus and took a seat beside the window. As it pulled away, Richard remained on the curb with his bag in one hand, and Margaret beside the waiting sedan. Richard watched until the bus disappeared into morning traffic. Then he turned to Margaret. You told me the donor wanted no contact. That is what the file states. I want to see the policy that prevented my letters from being delivered. Richard, and I want to know why Annie Walker's name frightened you more than any question I asked on that train. Margaret opened the car door, but Richard did not move. For nearly a year, St. Catherine had given him polished answers and asked him to be grateful. That morning, for the first time, he began to wonder whether gratitude had been the very thing they used to keep him from looking closer. The Route 16 bus left Annie at the east entrance of St. Catherine Medical Center a few minutes before 8. The glass doors opened onto a quiet corridor far removed from the main lobby, where Richard's photograph hung above a display announcing the anniversary celebration. Here, the walls were plain, the chairs were plastic, and no one waited with a camera. At the reception desk, Annie gave her name. The woman behind the computer searched twice. I don't see an appointment. It's at 8. Are you sure it's today? Annie took out the printed confirmation. The receptionist read it, then checked the screen again. You're in the living donor program. Yes, you should have said that. I gave you my name. The woman did not respond. She handed Annie a clipboard filled with questions Annie had already completed online. By the time a nurse called her, Richard was probably entering a conference room upstairs. Annie imagined fresh coffee, polished tables, and people greeting him before he had to state his name. She followed the nurse into an examination room and placed her backpack beneath the chair. The nurse checked her blood pressure, weight, and temperature. Any problems since your last follow-up? I still get tired. Some days the ache in my side comes back if I stand too long. Anything severe? No. Then recovery is going well. Annie watched her type. I had to cut my hours at work. The nurse continued entering information. That's not unusual. I also postponed school. You can discuss lifestyle concerns with the coordinator. Are you writing it down? The nurse stopped. I recorded that you have occasional fatigue. And the pain? You said it wasn't severe. That doesn't mean it isn't there. The nurse turned the screen slightly away. The physician will review everything. Annie had heard that sentence before. It meant the conversation was finished even if the problem was not. Dr. Samuel Reed entered several minutes later. At 63, he moved with the careful pace of a man who had spent decades trying not to make patients feel rushed. He shook Annie's hand and sat rather than standing over her. How was the trip from Birmingham? Long. Did the travel office cover the ticket? They never answered my application. Samuel frowned. That should have been handled. It wasn't. He opened her record. Your lab results from last month looked stable. How have you been feeling? Annie gave him the same answers she had given the nurse, but this time she watched the screen. Samuel paused when she mentioned work and school. Your file says you resumed normal activity 8 weeks after surgery. I went back to work. That isn't the same as normal. He looked at her. It also says I declined contact with the recipient, Annie added. Samuel scrolled lower. That is what the coordinator recorded. I wrote a letter. You did? I asked whether the surgery had worked. They told me the recipient didn't want contact. Samuel's expression changed. Did you keep a copy? No. Do you remember when you sent it? About 3 weeks after surgery. He made a note on a separate pad instead of typing into the computer. I want to review the correspondence log. Will I be allowed to see it? You should be allowed to see anything that reflects a decision you supposedly made. The word supposedly stayed in the room. After the examination, Samuel asked Annie to wait while he requested a printed summary of her file. The billing office called her name first. A clerk slid a statement beneath the glass partition. This balance is due today. Annie looked at the amount. The donor program said follow-up care was covered. Clinical services are covered. Transportation and administrative processing are separate. What administrative processing? The clerk pointed to a line without explaining it. I can't pay this today. We can set up a payment plan. I lost wages coming here. I paid for the train. Now I'm being charged for showing up? The clerk lowered her voice. I only handle the account. Annie folded the bill and put it into her backpack. On the way out, she passed through the main lobby. Richard's face filled a 6-foot poster beneath the words 1 year of second chances. Dr. Margaret Vale's name appeared below his. The surgeons were listed. So were the sponsors. There was no mention of a donor. Annie stood before the poster until her phone rang. The number belonged to Richard's office. She let it go to voicemail. A second call came 20 minutes later from a lawyer who said Mr. Whitmore wanted only to confirm whether both parties had once agreed to exchange letters. Annie declined to speak and ended the call. She was sitting near the hospital cafeteria when Samuel found her. He carried several printed pages. I compared the summary with my notes, he said. Some details are missing. Missing or removed? I don't know yet. He sat across from her and pointed to the record. Her reports of fatigue had been reduced to a single phrase, mild and resolving. Her delayed return to full work hours was not included. Neither was the postponement of college. Then Samuel showed her the contact section. Donor declines all future communication. That isn't my signature, Annie said. The form uses an electronic confirmation. I never confirmed it. Samuel looked toward the crowded cafeteria before lowering his voice. Keep this copy. Do not give it back to anyone. You believe me? I believe the record does not match what you are telling me, and that needs an explanation. Annie folded the pages beside the bill. That afternoon, an email arrived from St. Catherine's Communications Department. The hospital wanted to feature her in a short video about living donation. A prepared script was attached. It described her recovery as complete. It said she had returned quickly to ordinary life. It stated that anonymity had always been her personal choice. In exchange, the hospital offered to review her travel expenses and provide a small educational grant. Annie read the message twice, then forwarded it to Samuel with one sentence. They want me to repeat the lie before they help me. She declined the offer. At 4 that afternoon, she called the number Richard's lawyer had left. "I'll meet him once," she said. "Public place. No hospital staff, no cameras, no gifts, and no money." The meeting took place in a small room at the Atlanta Central Library. Richard arrived alone except for Daniel Brooks, his independent attorney, who remained outside after introducing himself. Annie placed her medical summary and the unsigned contact record on the table. Richard placed his worn envelope beside them. "I wrote this 9 months ago," he said. Annie opened her backpack and removed a photograph of the letter she had drafted before giving the original to the transplant coordinator. The date was 6 days after Richard's. Richard read the first line aloud. "I don't need to know your name. I only want to know you woke up and still have a future." Annie looked at his envelope. "What did they tell you? That you wanted nothing from me? Not even a letter. They told me the same thing about you." For a while, neither spoke. 2 letters sat between them, written by strangers who had both reached out and had both been told to stop. Richard finally said, "I spent almost a year looking for the person who saved me." Annie met his eyes. "Then maybe you should start by finding out what happened to them after they saved you." Richard nodded. The meeting had begun as a question about one missing letter. By the time they left the library, it had become a question about every promise St. Catherine had made to its donors, and how many of those promises had disappeared once the surgery was over. Annie returned to Birmingham on the afternoon train with the hospital bill folded inside her backpack, and Richard's unanswered questions still following her. She had slept for less than an hour. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the 2 letters lying on the library table, written 6 days apart and stopped by people who had claimed to be protecting them. Laverne Walker was waiting outside the station in an old silver sedan that made a clicking sound whenever the engine idled. She stood beside the driver's door with a bottle of water in one hand and a paper bag in the other. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired. That saves us both from pretending." Laverne took Annie's backpack before she could object and placed it in the back seat. At 58, she moved with the steady confidence of someone who had spent most of her life carrying more than people knew. She had worked in a public school cafeteria for nearly 3 decades, raised 2 younger sisters, and learned long ago that worry was most useful when turned into food, a ride home, or an extra $20 hidden in a coat pocket. She handed Annie the bag. Inside were a biscuit and a small container of sliced apples. "I ate on the train. Crackers don't count as a meal." "How did you know I had crackers?" "I packed them." Annie got into the car. Laverne waited until they had left the station before asking, "Did the hospital say everything was all right?" "My lab work is fine." "That wasn't what I asked." Annie looked out the window. Birmingham moved past in familiar pieces. Brick storefronts, church signs, a gas station advertising fried catfish on Fridays, and streets she had known since childhood. "They charged me for part of the follow-up," she said. "They also wrote things in my record that weren't true." Laverne kept both hands on the wheel. "What things?" "That I recovered without any problems. That I went back to normal activity after 8 weeks. That I refused contact with the recipient." "You wrote that man a letter." "I know." "Did they lose it?" "No." Annie paused. "I think they kept it." Laverne glanced at her. "You think, or you know?" "I met him." The car slowed even though the traffic light ahead was green. "You met the man who received your kidney?" "On the train." Laverne said nothing for several seconds. "Of all the people in Alabama and Georgia, you sat next to him?" "He sat next to me." "Did he know?" "Not at first." "And now?" "He suspects." Laverne pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store and stopped beneath a tree. She turned off the engine. "Start at the beginning." Annie told her about the water, the letters, Dr. Vale at the station, and the meeting at the library. She left out nothing except how relieved she had felt when Richard said he had written almost every month. That relief still embarrassed her. She had told herself she did not need gratitude, but knowing she had not been forgotten mattered more than she wanted to admit. When she finished, Laverne rested one hand on the steering wheel. "Was he respectful?" "Yes." "Did he offer you money?" "Not yet." "He will." "You sound certain." "He is a rich man who just discovered he owes something he cannot return. Money is the first language men like that speak when they are frightened." He didn't seem frightened. People with good suits learn to hide it. Back at the house, Laverne heated chicken soup and sliced cornbread at the kitchen counter. The small room smelled of pepper, onions, and the sweet tea cooling in a pitcher near the sink. Annie placed the hospital bill on the table beside a stack of unopened mail. Above the refrigerator handle, partly covered by the electric bill, was the acceptance letter from Jefferson Community College. Annie had been admitted to the diagnostic medical sonography program before surgery. She had planned to begin in January. January had passed, then August. Laverne noticed her looking at it. They'll still have classes next year. I know. That letter isn't a clock. It feels like one. Laverne set down a bowl of soup. Eat before you start measuring your whole life by one bad year. The next morning, Annie returned to the neighborhood pharmacy where she worked part-time. Her manager, Mr. Harlan, was arranging cold medicine behind the counter when she arrived. How did the appointment go? They said I'm stable. That's good. He hesitated before adding, I had to give your Saturday shift to Keisha. I can't keep changing the schedule at the last minute. I requested the day off 3 weeks ago. I know, but you've had several appointments this year. They require them. I'm not blaming you, Annie. I'm telling you what the schedule looks like. She understood. Small businesses did not have replacement staff waiting in another office. When Annie missed a shift, someone else stayed late. The hospital called follow-up care necessary, but necessity did not replace lost wages. I'll take the Tuesday closing shift, she said. Mr. Harlan nodded. That would help. In Atlanta, Richard sat across from Daniel Brooks in a conference room at Whitmore Capitol. The windows overlooked downtown, and Richard's untouched breakfast had gone cold near his elbow. Daniel was 52, with a careful voice and no professional connection to St. Catherine. That was why Richard had called him. I want every document related to donor communication and post-donation support, Richard said. The hospital may refuse on privacy grounds. I'm not asking for identities. They may still argue that the records are protected, then ask for policies, budgets, consent forms, reimbursement procedures, and reports with the names removed. Daniel made notes. St. Catherine receives several $1 million a year from your foundation. Part of that was designated for donor support. I'll trace how it was spent. Richard looked at the framed photograph hanging across the room. It showed him leaving St. Catherine after his transplant, one hand raised toward reporters. Margaret Vale stood beside him. The caption called the surgery a triumph of modern medicine and private philanthropy. No donor was mentioned. Daniel followed his gaze. This inquiry could damage your relationship with the hospital. If the relationship depends on my not asking where the money went, it should be damaged. It may also raise questions about your own role in their publicity. Richard looked back at him. It should. That afternoon, he called Annie. She was restocking shampoo near the back of the pharmacy and almost let the phone ring out. What did you find? She asked. Nothing yet. I wanted to know whether the hospital reimbursed your trip. No. Did they explain why? They gave me a parking voucher. Richard was silent. I told you that on the train, she said. I thought perhaps I had misunderstood. You didn't. I attended a donor support dinner last spring that cost more than your college tuition. That doesn't surprise me. It surprises me. Then maybe you haven't been paying attention. The words were blunt, but Richard did not object. You're right, he said. I haven't. Annie leaned against the shelf. What are you going to do? Find out whether the money was used to support donors or to make the hospital look as though it did. And after that? I don't know yet. It was the most honest answer he could have given. Before ending the call, Richard asked, Miss Walker, did anyone from St. Catherine contact you after our meeting? Not yet. They will. My aunt said the same thing about you offering money. Your aunt sounds perceptive. She would say suspicious. Richard almost laughed. Tell her I remember. Annie put the phone away and returned to work. In Atlanta, Richard opened the donor support budget Daniel had obtained from a public filing. The first page listed transportation, follow-up care, and education assistance. The later pages listed videos, printed brochures, a banquet, and media consulting. For the first time, Richard understood that St. Catherine had not ignored donor support entirely. It had simply spent more money describing its kindness than practicing it. 2 days after Richard reviewed the donor support budget, Annie received a call during her lunch break. The woman introduced herself as Melissa Grant from St. Catherine's communications office and spoke with the bright patience of someone reading from prepared notes. We would like to invite you to participate in a short film about living donation, Melissa said. Your story could encourage others to register. Annie sat at the small table behind the pharmacy, her untouched turkey sandwich still wrapped in paper. How did you get my number? It's listed in your patient file. My medical file? We coordinate closely with the transplant program. Annie looked through the narrow window in the break room door. Mr. Harlan was helping a customer compare 2 brands of cough syrup. What would I have to say? We would conduct a brief interview. Nothing difficult. We'd ask about your decision, your recovery, and how meaningful it feels to know the recipient is doing well. You know I met him. Melissa paused. We understand there was an unplanned interaction. Is that what you call it? We're trying to make certain the public receives accurate information. Then tell them I had to postpone college and pay for my own train ticket. Another pause followed. The video is meant to focus on the positive impact of donation. My life after the surgery is part of the impact. Of course, we can send you a draft script so you'll know what to expect. The script arrived 10 minutes later. It described Annie as fully recovered, grateful for St. Catherine's support, and committed to remaining anonymous. In exchange for participating, the hospital offered to reconsider her travel reimbursement, waive the disputed administrative fee, and provide a modest educational grant. Annie read the offer twice, then forwarded it to Samuel, Reed, and Richard. Her message contained one sentence. They will help me if I agree to say they already helped me. Richard called before her lunch break ended. Don't sign anything, he said. I wasn't planning to. I can have Daniel review the offer. You can send it to him, but I don't need a billionaire and a lawyer to tell me this is wrong. No, you don't. She heard papers moving on his desk. I can pay the bill and your travel expenses today. Annie closed her eyes. Laverne had predicted this before Richard ever made the offer. That won't solve the problem. It will solve the bill. For me? Yes. And what happens to the next donor who doesn't happen to meet you on a train? Richard did not answer immediately. If you pay my expenses privately, Annie continued, St. Catherine will say everything was resolved. They may even put it in a report as donor assistance. I would make it clear the money didn't come from them. They'll still use the result. One less complaint. One less unpaid bill. One less person asking questions. I'm trying to help. I know, but help that depends on knowing a billionaire isn't a system. It's luck. Richard leaned back in his chair, though Annie could only hear the faint movement. What do you want me to do? I want to know whether other donors were treated the same way. I want the hospital to stop offering basic support in exchange for a good story. I want someone to explain why they needed me to disappear after the surgery. That will take time. So did recovery. Richard was quiet. Then he said, I won't pay your bill privately. Thank you. That may be the first time anyone has thanked me for not paying a bill. You'll survive. I've been told I'm good at that. Before ending the call, Richard asked permission to share Melissa's email with Daniel. Annie agreed on the condition that her personal medical details remain private. That evening, Samuel drove to Birmingham after his clinic hours. Laverne invited him into the kitchen but did not offer the warm welcome she usually gave guests. She poured coffee for him, sweet tea for Annie, and sat across the table with both hands folded. You knew the girl was struggling, Laverne said. Samuel looked into his cup. I knew she reported fatigue and difficulty returning to work. That isn't what I asked. Annie recognized the tone. Laverne had used it for years on school administrators who answered simple questions with long explanations. Samuel met her eyes. Yes, I knew she was having a harder recovery than the final record showed. And what did you do? I added notes. Notes that disappeared. Yes. Laverne waited. Samuel sighed. I spoke to the program coordinator. I was told the surgical outcome was normal, and that employment or educational problems were outside our clinical reporting. Did you agree? No. But you stopped asking. I told myself I could help more patients by staying in my position than by creating a fight I might lose. Laverne lifted her coffee but did not drink. A man standing in the room and saying nothing can spend years telling himself he stayed to help. The people who needed his voice may remember it differently. Samuel accepted the words without defending himself. You're right. Annie placed the script from St. Catherine on the table. They want me to say my recovery was complete. Samuel read it slowly. His mouth tightened when he reached the section claiming anonymity had been Annie's choice. This is not consistent with what you told me, he said. It isn't consistent with what happened. Samuel opened the folder he had brought. Inside were copies of handwritten notes from Annie's previous appointments. They included her reduced work hours, transportation problems, delayed college enrollment, and repeated request for confirmation that the recipient had survived. "These were my original notes," he said. "They were not included in the annual donor summary." "Who decides what goes into the summary?" Richard asked through the speakerphone Annie had placed on the table. Samuel hesitated. "The Transplant Administration Office reviews the records before they are finalized." "Dr. Vale's office?" "Yes." Richard's voice remained controlled. "Will you give those notes to an independent investigator?" Samuel looked at Annie rather than the phone. "Only with Miss Walker's written permission." "You have it," Annie said, "but I don't want the names of other donors exposed." "They won't be." Laverne leaned back. "And what happens to you when the hospital finds out?" Samuel gave a tired smile. "I suppose I'll learn whether my position was ever as useful as I told myself it was." The following morning, Annie found a certified letter from St. Catherine in the mailbox. It reminded her that unauthorized disclosure of transplant information could violate her confidentiality agreement. The language did not accuse her of anything, but every paragraph warned of consequences. At the same time, a local business website published a short item about Richard's train ride. It described him as a recovering philanthropist who had shown kindness to an unidentified young woman seeking his attention. Annie read the sentence twice. Richard was presented as generous. She was presented as suspicious. She sent the article to him without comment. He called within minutes. "You never sought my attention." "I know. I'll have them correct it." "That isn't the point." "What is?" "They believed that version before anyone asked me. A wealthy white man offers water, so he must be kind. A black girl speaks to him, so she must want something." Richard did not argue. Annie continued, "You asked me what I want. Start by noticing how quickly people trust your intentions and question mine." "I notice now." "Good. Keep noticing when I'm not standing next to you." That afternoon, Daniel confirmed that several other donors had also reported unpaid travel costs and difficulties returning to work. The records described nearly all of them as having recovered normally. Richard closed the report and looked at the publicity photograph on his office wall. For months, he had believed St. Catherine was protecting a private donor. Now he understood that privacy had been applied in only one direction. His recovery had been placed on billboards, brochures, and banquet programs. The donor's hardships had been reduced to language no one outside the hospital would ever read. He called Daniel. "Expand the review." "To how many cases?" "All living donors from the last 5 years. Remove their names. Follow the money, the correspondence, and every change between the doctor's notes and the final reports. That could become a formal investigation." Richard looked at Annie's email on his screen. That's what it should become. 3 days after Richard expanded the review, Daniel Brooks sent him a preliminary list of inconsistencies. None of them proved deliberate wrongdoing on its own, but together they formed a pattern Richard could no longer dismiss. Medical notes mentioned extended fatigue, missed work, and transportation difficulties. Final summaries reduced those concerns to phrases such as stable recovery and no significant complications. Several donors had asked about contact with their recipients. Their files recorded that they preferred anonymity. Richard read the report twice before calling Annie. She answered during her walk home from the pharmacy. Traffic moved behind her, and a church bell marked 6 o'clock somewhere across the neighborhood. "Daniel found other cases," he said. "How many?" "Enough that I don't believe yours was an administrative mistake." Annie shifted the grocery bag in her hand. "What happens now?" "We request the original notes and compare them with the final reports. And if the hospital refuses, then we ask the board why." "That sounds simple when you say it." "It won't be simple." "No," Annie said. "It'll just be easier for you than it would be for any of us." Richard accepted the correction. That's true. They had begun speaking every few days, though the calls remained brief. Richard never asked again whether Annie had donated directly to him. Instead, he asked about the process, what she had been told, what she had expected, and what changed after she left the hospital. Annie answered only what she chose. One evening, he asked why she had wanted to study diagnostic medical sonography. "My mother had heart problems," Annie said. "I used to sit beside her during appointments. The technicians were usually the first people who treated her like she was more than a diagnosis. Usually, some people spoke to the screen instead of speaking to her. And the technicians didn't? Not the good ones." Richard looked through the windows of his office at the lights below. "You still want to do it?" "I don't know." "What changed?" "I learned hospitals can say they care about people while arranging everything around numbers. That happens in business too. Then maybe people in business shouldn't be surprised when it happens in hospitals they fund. The comment stayed with him after the call ended. 2 days later, Richard was reviewing a draft speech for the transplant anniversary when Margaret Vale entered his office at Whitmore Capital, without waiting for an invitation. His assistant followed, apologizing, but Richard dismissed him with a nod. Margaret placed the speech on the desk. "You removed the paragraph about the donor. I removed a statement that may be false. It says the donor chose anonymity. We have evidence that at least one donor's preference was recorded incorrectly. One case does not invalidate the program. It invalidates that sentence." Margaret sat across from him. "The event is in 4 days. Reporters have already confirmed attendance. We cannot turn an anniversary celebration into a public dispute over internal paperwork." "Then don't ask me to repeat something you haven't proved. The consent process is complex. Young donors sometimes misunderstand what they signed." Richard's expression changed. Annie Walker understood enough to know her letters disappeared. Margaret's hands remained folded. "You are allowing a personal encounter to influence your judgment. I'm allowing evidence to influence it. You met her on a train. She was tired, uncomfortable, and aware of who you were. You know nothing about her motives. I know she refused my money. That does not mean she wants nothing." Richard leaned back. "What do you think she wants?" Margaret hesitated only briefly. "Recognition. Influence. Perhaps a role in the program. And why would that be unreasonable? Because medical programs cannot be governed by individual emotional experiences. Her medical record was changed, summarized. Her letters were stopped, managed according to policy. Show me the policy." Margaret's composure tightened. "Our legal department is reviewing your request. You've had 3 days. We have privacy obligations." "To whom?" "To everyone." Richard looked at the speech again. "I will not say the donor rejected contact. Replace the paragraph or remove me from the program." Margaret stood. "You are the program's most visible success. That appears to be the problem." After she left, Daniel entered through the adjoining conference room carrying a sealed folder. "We found something," he said. "Annie's surgery date falls within the same week as yours." Richard did not move. Daniel continued. "There were only 3 living donor procedures at St. Catherine during that period. 2 were directed donations between relatives. The third was non-directed. Annie? The name is sealed. We obtained only the number of procedures from a public reporting database." Richard looked toward the door Margaret had closed behind her. "Can we lawfully confirm the identity?" "Not without Annie's authorization or a formal inquiry with access to the records." "Then we stop there." Daniel studied him. "You don't want to know?" "I want her to decide whether I know." Daniel closed the folder. "The access restrictions on that third file are unusual. Dr. Vale personally approved them." "What kind of restrictions?" "Correspondence, follow-up summaries, and administrative access were all limited to her office." Richard's suspicion sharpened, but he did not ask Daniel to go further. "Document the restriction. Don't open the file." That evening, Richard called Annie again. She was sitting at Laverne's kitchen table, filling out a form for another shift change. "The hospital wants me to speak at the anniversary event," he said. "I assumed they would. They gave me a paragraph saying the donor chose never to contact me." Annie stopped writing. "I refused to read it," he added. "Did they change it?" "Not yet. They will probably find different words that mean the same thing." "Then I won't read those either." Annie looked at the half-completed work form. "You don't have to fight every sentence for me. I'm not doing it for you alone." "Good." Richard smiled slightly. "You make gratitude difficult." "No, I make it inconvenient. That may be more accurate." He told her the event would be held Saturday morning. Richard did not ask her to attend. He knew the invitation needed to come from someone connected to her care, not from him. The next day, Samuel Reed called Annie. "I have been given several guest passes for the anniversary program," he said. "There will be a discussion about living donation. Will donors be part of the discussion?" "That is what the schedule claims." "Who is speaking?" "Dr. Vale, Mr. Whitmore, 2 surgeons, and a hospital administrator." "So no donors." Samuel was quiet. "No donors are listed." "Then it isn't a discussion about living donation." "I agree." Annie looked toward the refrigerator. Her college acceptance letter was still partly covered by the electric bill. "Why do you want me there?" "Because they are preparing to describe the choices donors made. Someone who actually made that choice should hear what they say." Do they know you invited me? No. Will that cause trouble for you? Probably. Annie thought about the certified letter, the video script, and the sentence describing anonymity as her decision. I'll think about it. That night, she placed the invitation on the kitchen table. Laverne read it while drinking tea. You want to go, she said. I don't know what I'd do there. You don't have to do anything. They're going to stand on a stage and tell people I wanted to disappear. Then listen. And if they lie? Laverne looked at her over the rim of the glass. Tell the truth if you're ready. Annie opened her wallet and removed the donor identification card. Her name, procedure date, and program number were printed beneath the St. Catherine's seal. Laverne touched the edge of the card but did not take it. Carry it, she said. You think I should show it? I think the truth should be with you when you walk into a room built around hiding it. What you do after that is your decision. On Saturday morning, Annie dressed in a plain navy dress and the same coat she had worn on the train. She placed the donor card in the inner pocket of her wallet, slipped the invitation into her bag, and left for Atlanta with Samuel. At St. Catherine, workers were already arranging flowers beneath a large photograph of Richard Whitmore. Across the bottom, gold letters announced a year of courage, medicine, and second chances. Annie stopped long enough to read every name printed beneath the photograph. Her own was not there. The auditorium filled slowly. Donors, recipients, hospital staff, trustees, and local reporters took their seats beneath a wide screen displaying Richard's photograph. Annie sat near the back beside Samuel, close enough to hear the speakers but far enough that no one on stage would notice her unless they looked carefully. A program rested on every chair. Annie opened hers and read the schedule. Margaret Vale would speak first, followed by two surgeons, the hospital president, and Richard. The final discussion was titled, Honoring the Gift of Life. No donor was listed as a participant. Samuel leaned toward her. You don't have to stay. I came to hear what they say, and if it becomes too much, I'll leave. He nodded, though neither of them believed she had traveled to Atlanta simply to walk away. At 9, the lights dimmed. Margaret stepped onto the stage as applause moved through the room. She thanked the trustees, praised the surgical team, and spoke about St. Catherine's growing reputation. A year ago, she said, Mr. Richard Whitmore received a gift from an anonymous living donor who asked for no recognition, no contact, and nothing in return. Annie's hand closed around the program. Margaret continued, That donor's decision reminds us that true generosity often asks to remain unseen. Samuel looked at Annie, but she kept her eyes on the stage. A photograph of Richard leaving the hospital appeared on the screen. Margaret described his recovery, his return to work, and the millions of dollars his foundation had contributed to transplant medicine. She called the surgery proof that modern medicine and private generosity could change lives. She did not mention the letters. She did not mention follow-up costs. She did not mention a donor sitting in the last few rows after traveling all night in coach. Richard sat with the other speakers, a folder closed on his lap. When Margaret used the phrase chose to remain unseen, he looked toward the audience. His eyes moved across the rows until they found Annie. His posture changed. Margaret reached the final page of her speech. Although the donor has declined all communication, we honor that person today by respecting the privacy they requested. Annie stood. Her chair made little noise, but Samuel heard it. So did the woman sitting in front of them, who turned around. That isn't true, Annie said. Margaret stopped. Several people looked toward the back of the auditorium. A photographer lowered his camera, uncertain whether the interruption was part of the program. Margaret kept one hand on the lectern. I'm sorry? I never asked you to tell him I wanted no contact. Samuel remained seated. He did not pull Annie down or speak for her. Margaret's face stayed composed. Miss Walker, this is not an appropriate setting for a discussion of private medical information. You were discussing my private choices before I stood up. A murmur passed through the room. Richard rose from his chair on stage but did not approach her. Margaret looked toward a hospital administrator near the side wall. We should take a short break. No, Richard said. The single word stopped the administrator. Margaret turned to him. Richard, we have a responsibility to protect everyone involved. Then let her finish. This could expose confidential information, only if she chooses to expose it. Margaret's eyes returned to Annie. Miss Walker, whatever concerns you have can be addressed through the proper channels. I tried the proper channels. Annie's voice shook, but she did not lower it. I asked whether the recipient survived. I wrote a letter. I asked for help getting to my follow-up appointments. I told your staff I had to reduce my work hours and postpone school. The proper channels recorded that I recovered without problems and wanted no contact. Margaret stepped away from the microphone. You are describing administrative issues that should not be confused with the medical success of the transplant. That is the problem, Annie said. You call it successful because he is alive. You never asked what success looked like for me. The room grew quiet. Richard stepped down from the stage. He stopped several feet from Annie, leaving the aisle open between them. Miss Walker, he said, are you saying you were the donor in my transplant? Margaret interrupted. Richard, do not ask her that here. Annie looked at him. The question had followed them from the train, through the station, and into every conversation since. This time, no contract, doctor, or prepared statement would answer for her. She reached into her bag and removed her wallet. Margaret's voice sharpened. Annie, you should think carefully before disclosing protected information. Annie opened the inner pocket and took out the donor identification card. I have thought carefully for almost a year. She walked down the aisle. No one stopped her. At the front of the auditorium, she placed the card on the table beneath the screen carrying Richard's photograph. The card was small enough to fit in her palm. Under the St. Catherine seal were her name, the date of the procedure, and the program number. Richard looked at the date first. Then he looked at Annie. His face lost the controlled expression he wore in public. It was you. Yes. He glanced at the program number, then at the anniversary date printed across the screen. There was no uncertainty left. Richard reached inside his jacket and removed the worn envelope Annie had seen on the train. I wrote this 9 months ago. I wrote to you too. They told me you refused it. They told me you didn't want mine. Richard held the letter at his side. For several seconds, the auditorium seemed to wait for him to say something worthy of the moment. He did not. He simply asked, Are you all right? The question caught Annie off guard. I'm here, she said. It was not a complete answer, and both of them knew it. Margaret returned to the microphone. This event cannot continue while private records are being discussed without review. Richard turned toward her. You stood on this stage and told everyone she chose to disappear. That is what the official file states. She says the file is wrong. We cannot rewrite policy based on an emotional interruption. Annie looked at the 6-foot photograph behind Margaret. But you can rewrite my life into a sentence that helps raise money. Several people in the audience began whispering. A trustee opened the printed program and reread the paragraph describing the anonymous donor. One of the reporters started taking notes. Margaret signaled to the technician, but Richard stepped toward the microphone before the screen could be turned off. My name and image are not to be used in any further St. Catherine campaign, he said. The hospital president stood. Richard, perhaps we should discuss this privately. We tried privacy. It appears only one side benefited from it. Margaret's voice remained controlled. You are making a decision before all facts have been reviewed. Then review them. Richard looked toward the trustees. Review the letters. Review the donor support budget. Review the difference between the doctor's notes and the final reports. Until that is done, there will be no anniversary campaign with my name attached to it. A reporter near the front raised her hand. Mr. Whitmore, are you alleging the hospital concealed the donor's identity against both parties' wishes? Richard looked at Annie before answering. I am saying Miss Walker has just given us evidence that the story we were told is incomplete. I will not speak for her beyond that. It was the first time someone with power in the room had refused to take Annie's voice while claiming to protect it. Margaret announced that the event was suspended. The audience rose slowly, but no one applauded. Trustees gathered near the stage. Reporters waited by the doors. Samuel walked forward and stopped beside Annie without touching her. Richard remained near the table, looking at the donor card. I carried a letter to a stranger for 9 months, he said quietly. You were sitting across from me the whole night. Annie put the card back into her wallet. You weren't supposed to find me. Richard looked toward Margaret, who was speaking urgently with the hospital president. No, he said. I'm beginning to think neither of us was supposed to find the truth. The hospital moved Richard and Annie into a small consultation room before reporters could gather around them. Samuel accompanied Annie, while Daniel Brooks arrived several minutes later. and remained near the open door. Margaret Vale had requested to attend, but Annie refused. For once, the hospital accepted her answer without asking her to explain it twice. Richard stood beside the table, still holding the worn envelope. Annie sat across from him with her backpack at her feet. Now that the auditorium had emptied, neither of them seemed to know how to begin. Richard placed the letter on the table. "Thank you." Annie looked at the envelope rather than at him. "You already said that. Not when I knew who I was thanking. Does knowing my name change what happened? It changes everything." "No, it changes what you know." Richard pulled out the chair but waited. "May I sit?" Annie nodded. He sat across from her, leaving the envelope between them. "You were 18. I still am. You went through that surgery for someone you had never met. I knew what I was doing. I'm not suggesting otherwise. It sounded like you were." Richard lowered his eyes. "Then I said it badly." Annie had spent months imagining what the recipient might say if they ever met. She had expected gratitude, disbelief, perhaps discomfort. She had not expected a man with Richard's influence to look as though every sentence required permission. "I didn't do it because you were important," she said. "I didn't know who you were. You were a number on a file." "I understand. I don't think you do. If the hospital had told me the kidney was going to a cashier, a mechanic, or someone who had never had more than $20 in the bank, I still would have agreed." Richard nodded. "That may be the part I understand most clearly." He opened the envelope and removed several folded pages. "I wrote this after I went back to work. Everyone kept congratulating me. They said I looked strong. They said I had beaten something." He glanced at the first page. "I didn't feel as though I had beaten anything. I felt as though someone else had stepped into a fight and paid part of the price for me." Annie's expression softened, but only slightly. "You didn't ask me to do it." "No, but I benefited from it. That doesn't make you guilty." "Maybe not. It does make me responsible for what I do next." Richard folded the letter again without reading it aloud. "I want to cover every expense the hospital failed to pay. Your travel, your appointments, the wages you lost. I also want to pay your tuition, if your aunt's house needs repairs or if you need a safer car." "No." He stopped. Annie sat straighter. "I knew this was coming. I'm not trying to insult you." "I know. Then why refuse before I finish?" "Because you're trying to solve the part of this that makes you uncomfortable. That isn't fair. It may not be comfortable, but it is fair." Annie pointed toward the envelope. "You just learned my name. You learned I missed work and postponed school. Your first answer is to write checks until those facts stop hurting. I'm trying to return something. You can't." The words landed harder than she intended, but she did not take them back. "You cannot give me back the year I spent wondering whether the surgery worked. You cannot return the semester I missed or the hours my aunt worked because I couldn't. And you cannot repay a kidney as though it were a loan." Richard's hands rested flat on the table. "Then tell me what I can do. I spoke today because the hospital lied, not because I wanted to be rewarded. I know that. Do you? Because if you pay everything for me, St. Catherine will call this a happy ending. The billionaire finds the donor gets a scholarship. Everyone goes home feeling generous. What is wrong with you receiving help? Nothing if the help exists for every donor who needs it." Richard leaned back. Annie continued, her voice calmer now. "I am glad someone like me could help someone like you. I mean that. I'm glad the surgery worked. I'm glad you can wake up, go to your office, take a train when your flight is canceled, and complain about coach seats." I complained very bravely. A reluctant smile crossed her face, then disappeared. "But I don't want to be the lucky donor who happened to meet a rich recipient. I want the next person to know how their rent will be paid if they miss work. I want them to know who covers the bus ticket or the hotel. I want their records to say what actually happened after they went home." Richard was quiet for several seconds. "You want a program, not a gift. I want responsibility, not gratitude dressed up as charity." Daniel remained by the door without interrupting. Samuel looked down at the folder in his lap. Richard turned to him. "Dr. Reed, did the hospital know she postponed school?" "Yes." "Did they know she reduced her work hours?" "Yes." "Did those facts appear in the final donor report?" "No." Richard looked back at Annie. "Then we investigate all of it. The hospital will choose its own investigators. Not if I can prevent it." There it is again. "What?" "You deciding everything." Richard exhaled slowly. "Then how should it be done?" An independent review. No one from Dr. Vale's department controlling the records. Donors should have their own lawyer or advocate. Not one paid to protect the hospital. Daniel spoke for the first time. That can be arranged. Annie turned toward him. Can it be arranged without Mr. Whitmore owning the process? Yes. An outside ethics group can appoint the investigators. His foundation can fund the review without selecting who conducts it. Richard looked at Annie. Would that be acceptable? It would be a beginning. He nodded. Then that is what we will request. Request? Demanding it would prove your point about me deciding everything. Annie studied him before nodding once. Laverne arrived 20 minutes later after driving from Birmingham. She entered the room, greeted Samuel and Daniel, then looked at Richard. Mr. Whitmore. Miss Walker, did you offer her money? Richard glanced at Annie. Several times. In several forms. And? She said no. Laverne put a hand on the back of Annie's chair. Good. Now perhaps you can both discuss what she actually asked for. Richard did not appear offended. That is what we were trying to do. A thank you is a fine beginning, Laverne said. But it won't return the months she lost. Keeping your word may protect the months she has left. Richard looked at Annie. Then I'll keep it. She did not thank him. A promise from a powerful man was still only a promise, and both of them understood that trust would depend on what happened after the room emptied. Before leaving, Richard placed the unopened letter in front of her. This was written to you, he said. It should have reached you months ago. Annie rested her fingers on the envelope but did not open it. Outside the consultation room, hospital officials were already discussing statements, schedules, and damage control. Inside, Richard finally understood that Annie had not stepped forward to collect a debt. She had stepped forward because an entire system had mistaken her silence for consent, and she intended to make certain it never made that mistake again. By Monday morning, St. Catherine had removed Richard's anniversary photographs from the main lobby. The 6-foot poster disappeared first. The smaller displays near the elevators followed before noon. In their place, the hospital installed signs promising an internal review and continued commitment to patient privacy. Annie read about the changes on her phone during a break at the pharmacy. They took down the poster, she told Laverne that evening. Laverne placed a pan of cornbread on the stove. That was quick. They haven't admitted anything. Taking down a man's face is easier than admitting why they put it up. Richard's name had vanished from the hospital's website too, but the section about living donation remained almost unchanged. It still described donors as fully supported before, during, and after surgery. It still claimed that travel assistance was available when needed. Daniel sent Annie a copy and asked her to mark every statement that did not match her experience. She returned 3 pages covered in notes. 2 days later, he called. We found 12 other donors whose final summaries don't match the original clinical notes, he said. Annie stood near the stockroom door, keeping her voice low. Do they know you're reviewing their records? The records were stripped of names before we received them. We can see the differences, but we can't contact the donors without permission. So they're still numbers. For now. That's how this started. I know. Daniel explained that St. Catherine had reported almost every donor as having returned to normal activity within 3 months. The original notes told a different story. One donor had lost a warehouse job after missing too many shifts. Another had driven 6 hours for follow-up visits because no local clinic had been approved. A third had requested counseling after her family stopped supporting her decision. None of those details appeared in the annual reports. What happened to the support fund? Annie asked. We're tracing it. Richard already showed me the public budget. The public budget groups expenses under broad categories. A video campaign can be listed as donor education. A banquet can be called community outreach. A consultant who helps prepare donors for interviews can be classified as support services. They spent donor money teaching donors what to say? We haven't proved that yet, but that's what it looks like. Yes. That afternoon, Richard received an invitation to meet privately with the chair of St. Catherine's board. Margaret Vale was already in the room when he arrived. She sat at the far end of the table beside the hospital president and 2 attorneys. A printed statement had been placed at Richard's seat. He did not pick it up. The board chair, Thomas Bell, began carefully. We all agree that the anniversary event was mishandled. Richard looked at Margaret. That is a small description of a large problem. Thomas folded his hands. The hospital is prepared to apologize to Miss Walker for the confusion surrounding communication preferences. There was no confusion. Margaret spoke before Thomas could respond. The documentation was incomplete. We are reviewing how that happened. Her letter disappeared. It was retained under the confidentiality policy. Where is that policy? One of the attorneys slid a folder across the table. Richard opened it and read the first page. This was approved 4 months after my transplant. Margaret's expression did not change. It formalized procedures that were already in place. Then show me the earlier version. We are still locating archived materials. Richard closed the folder. You used a policy that did not yet exist to justify withholding letters written months earlier. Thomas glanced at the attorneys. Margaret replied, the clinical team had discretion when contact might create emotional or legal risk. Risk to whom? To both parties. Annie Walker was 18, losing wages, delaying school, and asking whether I survived. You classified her request as a risk, and my photograph as a fundraising opportunity. This conversation is becoming personal. It became personal when your department used my recovery to raise money while hiding the person who made it possible. Margaret turned to the board chair. This is precisely why transplant communication must be managed by professionals rather than recipients acting from guilt. Richard's voice remained quiet. Do not call accountability guilt because you find it easier to dismiss. The meeting ended without agreement. The board promised to review the evidence, but Richard left knowing promises were now St. Catherine's cheapest resource. That evening, Rebecca Sloan called Daniel from her car in the hospital parking garage. I can't speak from my office, she said. Rebecca had worked as a transplant coordinator at St. Catherine for 9 years. She had met Annie before surgery, collected her consent forms, and accepted the letter Annie wrote after the procedure. Daniel put the call on speaker with Richard's permission. Are you represented by counsel? Daniel asked. Not yet. You should be. I know. Rebecca's breathing was unsteady. The hospital told us all donor. Recipient correspondence had to go through Dr. Vale's office. We were supposed to log each letter, forward it for review, and wait for approval. Did approval usually come? Sometimes. Mostly when the letters were suitable for newsletters or donor events. Richard leaned forward. What made a letter unsuitable? Requests for medical updates. Questions about reimbursement. Anything suggesting the donor's recovery was difficult. Dr. Vale said direct contact could create expectations. What expectations? Money, relationships, public complaints. Daniel asked, did you retain copies? Rebecca was silent for several seconds. Yes. How many? 40, 3 donor letters and 28 recipient letters. Richard looked at Daniel. Rebecca continued. Some were delivered. Most were not. The system records many of them as declined by the other party. Were they declined? Daniel asked. Not all of them. Annie Walker's? Rebecca's voice dropped. No. Richard closed his eyes briefly. She gave me the letter herself, Rebecca said. She asked me only to confirm that the recipient had survived. Dr. Vale told me not to deliver it. 6 days earlier, your first letter had already arrived. You saw both? Yes. And you told Annie I wanted no contact? I repeated what I was ordered to say. Richard's anger sharpened. You knew it was false. Yes. The answer left no room for defense. Daniel asked where the copies were stored. I kept them at home after the office began destroying older correspondence drafts. I told myself I was preserving records in case anyone asked later. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Because I have a mortgage, a daughter in college, and a job I spent years earning. Rebecca paused. Those are reasons. They are not excuses. Richard glanced at Samuel, who had joined them by video call. Neither man commented. Rebecca continued. There's more. The Donor Support Fund paid for media coaching, anniversary materials, executive travel, and consulting fees. Reimbursement requests were delayed until the end of each quarter. If the money had already been reassigned, donors were told the request was incomplete. Who approved the transfers? Daniel asked. Dr. Vale and the transplant finance director. Can you prove it? I copied the authorization emails. Daniel's tone became firmer. Do not send anything from a hospital account. Speak to an attorney first. We can arrange secure delivery to the independent ethics group. Rebecca agreed to meet the following morning. Before ending the call, she asked to speak to Annie. Daniel contacted her, and Annie joined several minutes later. Rebecca's voice changed when she heard her answer. Annie, I'm sorry. Annie sat at Laverne's kitchen table with Richard's letter beside her. She had finally opened it the night before but had read only the first page. You looked me in the face and told me he didn't want my letter, she said. I know. You watched me leave believing that. Yes. Why should I trust you now? You shouldn't. Not yet. Rebecca drew a breath. But I kept your letter. I kept his too. I can prove neither of you refused contact. Annie looked at Laverne, who stood by the sink listening. Then don't give the evidence to Richard, Annie said. Don't give it to the hospital. Give it to the independent investigators. I will. And when they ask what you did, tell them all of it. Rebecca's reply came quietly. I will. The next afternoon, Daniel placed copies of the withheld letters, budget transfers, and authorization emails before the outside ethics council. 43 donor voices and 28 recipient voices had been stored away, while St. Catherine printed brochures celebrating connection, courage, and care. For years, the hospital had treated donors as necessary to the surgery but inconvenient to the story. Now those missing voices had become evidence. The board of St. Catherine met behind closed doors the following Thursday. Richard arrived with Daniel Brooks and a representative from the outside ethics group. Margaret Vale sat beside the hospital president with 2 attorneys and a binder thick enough to suggest that every decision had already been given a safer explanation. Annie had been invited, but she declined. I've told them what happened, she said when Richard called the night before. They have my records, my letter, and Dr. Reed's notes. I'm not sitting in another room while people study my face to decide whether I sound credible. Richard understood. May I tell them why you chose not to attend? You may tell them I'm tired of being treated as evidence when they refuse to read the evidence. The board chair, Thomas Bell, opened the meeting by reminding everyone that no final conclusions had been reached. Daniel placed 3 folders on the table. These are not conclusions, they are records. The first contained letters logged as rejected even though they had never been offered to the intended recipients. The second contained clinical notes that differed from final donor summaries. The third traced money designated for donor transportation, counseling, and education into publicity events, consulting fees, and executive travel. Margaret opened the first folder without touching the others. You obtained confidential correspondence. The letters were provided voluntarily by the coordinator who retained them, Daniel said. Names unrelated to this inquiry have been removed. Rebecca Sloan violated hospital procedure by taking records home. She preserved documents your department had begun destroying. Margaret turned to the board. That statement has not been proven. Daniel slid a copy of an email across the table. The subject line read, Retention Cleanup. Beneath it, the Transplant Administration Office instructed staff to discard correspondence drafts older than 6 months, unless approved for educational or promotional use. One trustee read the message twice. Why would personal letters be retained for promotion but destroyed for clinical review? Margaret answered without hesitation. Because approved educational materials require separate consent and documentation. That does not answer the question, Richard said. Margaret looked at him. You have already decided what you believe. I decided the official story was false when Annie showed me her donor card. You decided based on an emotional encounter. Richard placed both hands on the table. You continue to use the word emotional whenever a fact becomes inconvenient. The hospital president intervened. Let us keep this professional. I am, Richard said. Professionally, your program told 2 people that each had rejected the other. Professionally, it minimized donor hardships in official reports. Professionally, it spent money intended for recovery support on materials that praised the program. Margaret closed the folder. The transplant saved your life. Yes, our survival rates improved. Donor complications remained within accepted limits. The program attracted funding that allowed us to perform more surgeries. And that excuse is changing records? It explains the pressure under which decisions were made. Thomas Bell looked at her. Are you acknowledging that records were changed? I am saying summaries are not transcripts. Clinical teams exercise judgment about what information is relevant. Samuel Reed had joined the meeting by video. His face appeared on a screen at the end of the table. I reported Miss Walker's reduced work hours, transportation problems, continuing fatigue, and delayed education, he said. Those facts were relevant to her recovery. Margaret turned toward the screen. You signed the final summary. Samuel did not avoid the accusation. I did. I should not have. Then responsibility does not belong to my office alone. No, Samuel said. It belongs to everyone who saw the difference and accepted it. That includes me. His admission quieted the room more effectively than any defense could have. Rebecca appeared by video next. Her attorney sat beside her. Did Dr. Vale instruct you not to deliver Annie Walker's letter? Daniel asked. Yes. Was Richard Whitmore's letter already in the office? Yes. Did either person reject contact? Not according to anything I received. Margaret's attorney leaned forward. Were you ever told that communication could create financial expectations? Yes. Was that concern unreasonable when the recipient was a billionaire? Rebecca looked directly into the camera. The concern may have been discussed. The lie was still a lie. After the testimony ended, Margaret requested a private statement. She stood at the far end of the table, no longer speaking as the program's public face but as a woman defending the work around which she had built her career. I made decisions to protect a fragile program, she said. Living. Donor transplantation depends on trust, funding, and public confidence. One public conflict can discourage future donors and cost future recipients their chance to live. Richard looked at her. You protected confidence by hiding facts that might weaken it. I protected the program from stories that could be misunderstood. Annie losing wages is not a misunderstanding. It is not the whole story. It is part of her story. You removed it because it did not support yours. Margaret's voice tightened. You are willing to damage a program that saved you because one donor is dissatisfied with her aftercare. Richard remained seated. No. I am willing to stop funding a program that treats donors as valuable before surgery and inconvenient afterward. Several trustees exchanged glances. Thomas Bell called for a recess. Richard and Daniel waited in a smaller room across the hall while the board remained behind closed doors. Richard called Annie. They're voting, he said. On what? Whether to authorize an independent investigation with full access to records and finances. Who chooses the investigators? The outside ethics group, not the hospital, not me. And donor representation? One donor advocate with access to the process, chosen by former donors. Annie was silent for a moment. That matters more than your name being on it. I know. Do you? I'm learning. The call ended before the board reconvened. When Richard returned, Thomas Bell read the decision. By a vote of 9-3, the board authorized a fully independent investigation into donor communication, aftercare reporting, and use of restricted funds. All relevant records were to be preserved. Outside counsel would oversee access. Former donors would select an advocate to observe the process. Margaret would remain in her position during the initial review. But her authority over donor correspondence, reimbursement decisions, and record summaries was suspended immediately. This decision is not a finding of guilt, Thomas said. No, Richard replied. It is permission to look. Margaret gathered her papers. As she passed Richard, she stopped. You may destroy more than you repair. Richard looked toward the closed boardroom doors. Then the program was built on something weaker than truth. That evening, Annie received the official notice by email. It was 3 pages long and used the word transparency 7 times. She read only the section confirming that donors would help select their own advocate. Laverne stood beside the kitchen counter. Did they vote? Yes. Did you win? Annie closed the email. They agreed to start looking. Laverne nodded. That isn't the same thing. No. But for the first time since her surgery, the hospital would not decide alone which parts of a donor's life deserved to be recorded. The closed door had not opened yet, but someone had finally removed the lock. The independent investigation began the following week in offices rented several blocks from St. Catherine. The ethics group chose the location so hospital employees could testify without passing through the transplant wing or being seen entering Richard's building. Annie's first interview lasted 3 hours. 2 investigators sat across from her with a recorder between them. One asked questions while the other took notes. A donor advocate named Helen Price remained beside Annie. Helen had donated part of her liver to her brother 11 years earlier and had spent the years since helping families understand medical consent forms. You may stop at any time, Helen said before the recorder was turned on. You may also refuse any question. Annie nodded. She had heard similar words before surgery, but this time the person saying them did not work for the institution being examined. The investigators asked about the evaluation process, the confidentiality agreement, the missing letter, her requests for travel assistance, and each follow-up appointment. They asked what she remembered being told and what she understood when she signed the forms. By the second hour, Annie's answers became shorter. Did anyone explain that the hospital could withhold correspondence even if both parties agreed to receive it? No. Were you told your recovery concerns might be excluded from the annual summary? No. Did Dr. Vale ever speak to you about the difference between clinical recovery and financial hardship? No. Did anyone? Annie looked at Helen. How many ways do you need me to say no? The investigator closed the folder. You're right. We can pause. I don't need a pause. I need you to stop asking the same question in different clothes. Helen touched the edge of the table. That is enough for today. Annie gathered her coat. Outside, Richard waited in the hallway with Daniel. He stood when she came out. How did it go? He asked. It went. You look exhausted. I spent 3 hours proving I remember my own life. Richard glanced toward the interview room. Do you want me to speak to them? No. I only meant about the length of the session. I know what you meant. He stopped. Annie adjusted the strap of her bag. Every time someone makes this difficult, you want to step in. I understand why. But if you walk into that room angry on my behalf, the story becomes about how strongly Richard Whitmore defended me. That is not what I want. Then let me be tired without turning it into your assignment. Richard nodded. All right. She started toward the elevator, then looked back. You can still buy lunch. He allowed himself a small smile. That sounds dangerously close to permission. It's a sandwich, not a legal settlement. They ate at a quiet cafe across the street. Richard asked no questions about the interview. He talked instead about the train service between Birmingham and Atlanta, which Annie suspected. Over the next 4 weeks, the investigation widened. The ethics group interviewed former donors, transplant coordinators, finance staff, nurses, surgeons, and board members. Some spoke freely. Others arrived with attorneys and answered only what documents could prove. The records showed that donor support requests had been delayed, returned for minor errors, or closed without notice. A transportation fund had covered conference travel for senior staff because the expenses were classified under program development. Publicity contracts had been charged to donor education. Letters containing praise were more likely to be delivered than letters containing questions. The investigators also found that St. Catherine's public success rates had not been falsified. The surgeries had been medically effective. That fact became Margaret Vale's strongest defense. During her second interview, she sat with counsel and answered in a measured voice. The program saved lives, she said. No donor suffered a catastrophic medical outcome under my leadership. The lead investigator replied, the review is not limited to catastrophic outcomes. Then the standard is being changed after the fact. The hospital promised follow-up support, accurate records, and honest communication. Those were existing standards. Margaret looked down at the policy binder. Resources are limited. We prioritized surgical safety, while using restricted support funds for media campaigns. Public confidence produces future donations. Donations meant for whom? Margaret did not answer directly. Samuel Reed testified again and provided copies of handwritten notes from 7 other donor cases. In each one, employment, caregiving, transportation, or emotional strain had been reduced in the final record. I signed some of those summaries, he said. The investigator asked, why? Because I believed objections would change nothing. And now? Now I understand that silence changed something. It made the omissions look unanimous. Rebecca Sloan turned over the original correspondence logs. 43 donor letters and 28 recipient letters had been retained. 12 pairs showed that both sides had requested some form of contact, yet each had been told the other declined. Rebecca's attorney advised her to answer narrowly, but she refused. I want the record to show that I followed orders I knew were wrong, she said. I also want it to show that the system rewarded obedience and called it professionalism. Outside the interviews, pressure began to reach Annie in quieter ways. A customer at the pharmacy recognized her from a local news report and asked whether she planned to sue the hospital. Another told her she was brave, then requested a photograph. Mr. Harlan moved her to the stockroom for the rest of the shift. You don't have to protect me, Annie said. I'm protecting the line at the register, he replied. People are buying cough drops and asking for political statements. At home, mail arrived from strangers. Some thanked her. Some accused her of damaging public trust in organ donation. One unsigned letter said people like her should be grateful a respected hospital had accepted her into the program at all. Laverne read that one, folded it once, and dropped it into the trash. "You don't want to keep it for the investigators?" Annie asked. "No, some words aren't evidence. They're garbage." Annie laughed, but the sound ended quickly. That night, Richard called. "Daniel told me about the letters being sent to your house." "Of course he did. I can arrange security screening for your mail." "No, Annie. No, I don't want guards, drivers, or people checking every envelope before my aunt touches it. I'm trying to prevent harm. I know, but you keep offering solutions that turn my life into a place owned by your staff." Richard was silent. Annie sat at the kitchen table, turning the donor card between her fingers. "Do you know what I need from you right now? Tell me. When reporters ask what happened, don't answer for me. They ask me every day. Then say the investigation is continuing. They want to know whether I forgive the hospital. That question belongs to you. They also ask whether you regret donating. That one doesn't." Richard understood. "I'll stop answering it. Thank you." The next morning, he appeared outside St. Catherine after another board meeting. Reporters gathered around him. "Mr. Whitmore, does Annie Walker regret becoming a donor?" Richard looked toward the cameras. "You will have to ask Miss Walker what she thinks. Her voice was ignored once already. I won't help anyone do it again. Do you believe Dr. Vale should be removed? I believe the investigators should finish their work. Are you protecting the hospital? No. I am protecting the difference between evidence and performance." The clip aired that evening. Annie watched it beside Laverne. "He finally learned to give a short answer," Laverne said. "He had a good teacher." By the end of the 12th week, the investigators had completed more than 60 interviews and reviewed 5 years of records. Their preliminary findings confirmed altered summaries, withheld correspondence, misuse of restricted funds, and a pattern of treating donor hardship as a public relations risk rather than part of aftercare. A public ethics hearing was scheduled for the following month. The notice stated that former donors would speak first. Annie read that line several times. For months, people had spoken about her, for her, around her, and above her. Now the room would begin with the voices St. Catherine had spent years placing at the end. The public ethics hearing was held in St. Catherine's largest conference hall, not the auditorium where Annie had revealed her identity. The anniversary banners were gone. In their place stood a long table for the independent panel, microphones for witnesses, and rows of chairs filled with former donors, hospital employees, reporters, and members of the public. Annie sat beside Helen Price in the front row. Laverne was on her other side, wearing the navy suit she reserved for church funerals and meetings where she expected someone to lie. "You don't have to read every page," Helen whispered. "Speak in your own words." "I wrote the pages so I wouldn't forget my own words." Laverne reached over and straightened the corner of Annie's notes. "Then use them when you need them, and put them down when you don't." Across the aisle, Richard sat with Daniel. He had declined the place St. Catherine offered him beside the board members and taken a chair among the witnesses instead. Margaret Vale entered with her attorney moments before the hearing began. She did not look toward Annie. The chair of the ethics panel opened the session by summarizing the investigation. Over 5 years, donor concerns had been omitted or softened in official reports. Correspondence had been withheld without clear consent. Money designated for transportation, counseling, and educational support had been redirected to publicity, consulting, and administrative travel. The panel had found no evidence that surgical outcomes were falsified, but it concluded that St. Catherine's definition of success had been too narrow to include what happened to donors after discharge. Then the witnesses were called. A warehouse worker described losing his job after repeated follow-up visits. A woman from Tennessee explained that she had driven nearly 400 miles for appointments because the hospital would not approve a closer clinic. Another donor said she had asked for counseling and received a brochure about resilience. None of them raised their voices. They did not need to. When Annie's name was called, Laverne squeezed her hand once and let go. Annie walked to the witness table carrying her notes and donor card. She placed both beside the microphone, then gave her name and age for the record. The panel chair spoke gently. "Miss Walker, please describe what you believe St. Catherine failed to understand about your experience." Annie looked at the prepared pages. Then she looked at the former donors behind her and left the pages untouched. "They understood the surgery," she said. What they failed to understand was that I was still a person after they took me out of the operating schedule. A few people lowered their eyes. I was told I would be supported during recovery. But when I lost work hours, that was called an employment problem. When I delayed college, that was called a personal decision. When I asked for help with transportation, I was given a parking voucher even though I traveled by train. One panel member asked, "Did you report these problems during follow-up care?" Yes. And were they included in the final record? No. Why do you believe they were excluded? Because they made the program look less successful. Margaret's attorney stood. Objection. Miss Walker cannot testify to the motives of hospital administrators. The panel chair nodded. Miss Walker, please limit your answer to what you observed. Annie turned toward Margaret. I observed that when my story was useful for a video, the hospital offered to reconsider my expenses. I observed that the script said my recovery was complete and anonymity had been my choice. Neither statement was true. The attorney sat down. Annie picked up the donor card. This card proves I gave a kidney. It does not prove I gave St. Catherine ownership of what happened afterward. It does not mean they could speak for me, change what I said, or decide which parts of my recovery deserve to exist. She placed the card on the table. For almost a year, I believed the recipient did not want to hear from me. Mr. Whitmore believed I wanted nothing to do with him. Both of us wrote letters. Both letters were kept. The hospital called that privacy. Her voice tightened, but she continued. Privacy should protect a person's choice. It should not replace the choice. Confidentiality should not mean that the institution gets to control the truth while the patient remains silent. The room stayed still. The panel chair asked, "Do you regret donating?" Annie glanced toward Richard. No. I regret that the hospital believed my decision to donate required me to accept everything that followed without question. Richard lowered his head for a moment. I am glad Mr. Whitmore survived, Annie said. I was glad before I knew his name, and I am glad now. But gratitude should not erase accountability. A recipient can be thankful and still ask how the donor was treated. A donor can be generous and still demand honesty. Margaret's attorney approached the microphone. Miss Walker, Mr. Whitmore offered to pay your expenses and tuition. Correct? Yes. And you refused? Yes. Wouldn't that suggest your financial losses were not as serious as you now claim? Laverne shifted in her seat, but Annie answered before anyone could object. No. It suggests I understood the difference between help and a private rescue. The attorney paused. If I accepted money from him, my problem might disappear. The policy would remain. The next donor would still depend on luck. And St. Catherine could point to me as proof that everything ended well. I did not come here to become the exception they used to avoid changing the rule. The panel chair thanked her. Annie gathered her notes but left the card on the table until Helen quietly reminded her. Richard was called next. He took the same seat Annie had used and faced the panel. Mr. Whitmore, the chair said, you were a major donor to St. Catherine and the public face of its transplant program. Do you believe the hospital misled you? Yes. Do you consider yourself a victim of that conduct? Richard looked toward Annie before answering. I was deceived, but I was not the person who paid the greatest price. He explained that he had accepted the hospital's statements because they were convenient. He had attended banquets, appeared in videos, and allowed St. Catherine to present his recovery as proof of its values. I asked for the donor's name, he said, but I did not ask how donors were supported. I asked whether I could send a letter, but I did not ask where the support money went. I believed gratitude was enough because gratitude required less of me than scrutiny. The panel chair asked, are you saying you share responsibility? Yes, not for altering records or withholding letters, but for lending my name to a story I had not examined. Margaret finally looked at him. Richard continued, wealth gives people access to rooms where decisions are made. It also allows us to leave those rooms without noticing who was never invited inside. I benefited from that difference. I will not pretend otherwise. When testimony ended, the panel recessed before announcing its recommendations. Reporters crowded the hallway, but Richard did not approach Annie until she stood apart from them with Laverne. You said what the room needed to hear, he told her. Annie slipped the donor card back into her wallet. I said what I needed placed on the record. Richard nodded. That matters more. Behind them, the doors to the hearing room reopened. For the first time, the hospital was about to issue a decision after beginning with the donors' voices rather than ending with them. The ethics panel returned after 40 minutes. By then, The reporters had been moved behind a marked line near the back wall, and the witnesses had taken their seats again. Annie sat between Laverne and Helen Price, her notes closed on her lap. The panel chair read the findings without ceremony. St. Catherine had failed to obtain clear consent before withholding correspondence, misrepresented donor preferences, omitted material information from follow-up summaries, and used restricted support funds for purposes unrelated to direct donor care. The panel recommended immediate leadership changes, outside financial supervision, correction of affected medical records, and direct notification to every donor and recipient whose letters had been withheld. Margaret Vale remained still until the chair addressed her position. The panel finds that Dr. Vale exercised authority in ways that placed institutional reputation above informed choice. We recommend her removal as director of the transplant program and referral of the matter to the hospital's professional ethics board. A murmur passed through the room. Margaret's attorney leaned toward her, but she stood before he could speak. "This program performed hundreds of successful transplants under my direction," she said. "That record should not be erased." The panel chair looked at her. "It is not being erased. It is being examined in full. You are allowing administrative failures to overshadow lives saved." Annie watched Margaret's face. Even now, she spoke as though every criticism threatened the existence of the program itself. Samuel Reed answered from the witness section. "No one is denying the lives that were saved." Margaret turned toward him. Samuel continued, "We are acknowledging the people we stopped seeing once the surgery was counted as successful." The board chair, Thomas Bell, rose and announced that St. Catherine accepted the recommendations. Margaret would be placed on administrative leave immediately. Her access to donor records, financial accounts, and transplant correspondence would be suspended pending the ethics review. Margaret looked at Richard. "You understand what this will do to public confidence." Richard remained seated. "Public confidence should come from conduct that can survive examination." For the first time, Margaret had no prepared response. She gathered her papers and left through a side door with her attorney. No reporters were permitted to follow. The panel then presented the required reforms. A separate donor care office would be created outside the transplant department's chain of command. Donors would receive independent legal and medical advocates before signing consent forms. Travel, lodging, lost wages, counseling, and educational delays would be assessed as part of recovery rather than dismissed as personal matters. All correspondence would be logged by an independent coordinator. A letter could be withheld only for a documented safety or legal reason, and both parties would be informed that the decision had been made. Annie listened closely as each promise was read. Some were clear. Others sounded like language that could become flexible once attention moved elsewhere. When the chair finished, Helen raised her hand. "Who will review whether these reforms are working 6 months from now?" Thomas Bell answered. "The Board Compliance Committee." Helen did not lower her hand. "The same board that allowed the earlier system to continue?" Several trustees shifted in their seats. Annie stood. "Former donors should be part of that review." Thomas looked toward her. "The hospital is prepared to establish a donor advisory council. Advisory means you can listen and ignore us." The room became quiet again. "What authority are you requesting?" he asked. "Access to anonymized complaints, reimbursement delays, correspondence decisions, and changes made between clinical notes and final summaries. The council should issue a public report each year, not a private memo." One trustee whispered to another. Thomas said, "That level of access may create privacy concerns." "Then remove names," Annie replied. "You removed our names easily enough when you wanted to hide what happened." Laverne lowered her eyes, concealing a brief smile. Richard did not speak. Annie noticed that and understood he was keeping the promise he had made. He would not take her demand and repeated in a louder voice. Helen added, "The council must also have the right to refer unresolved complaints directly to the independent ethics office." Thomas asked for a brief recess with the board. This time, the discussion lasted only 12 minutes. When he returned, he announced that the Donor Advisory Council would have 5 former donors, 1 donor advocate, 1 physician who did not report to the transplant director, and 1 non-voting hospital administrator. It would receive quarterly reports and publish an annual assessment. Unresolved concerns could be referred outside St. Catherine. "The hospital would like Miss Walker to serve as the first chair," Thomas said. Annie did not answer immediately. A few reporters began writing before she had spoken. She looked at Helen. "Did you know they were going to ask me?" "No. Then she looked at Richard. "This is your decision," he said. Annie faced the board. "I'll serve for 1 year, under 3 conditions." Thomas waited. "I will not be paid by Richard Whitmore or the transplant program. Any stipend must come from the Independent Ethics Fund. My medical care must remain separate from my counsel role, and my name and story cannot be used in fundraising without written permission for each use." Thomas nodded slowly. "Those conditions are reasonable." "One more thing," Annie said. "The first meeting includes the donors whose letters were withheld. Not their files, them. We will need their consent. Then ask for it honestly." Thomas agreed. Outside the hearing room, reporters called Annie's name. She stopped only once. "Do you feel justice was done?" one asked. "Part of it," Annie said. "What remains? The hospital has made promises before. Justice is what happens after people stop watching." She walked past the cameras with Laverne and Helen. Richard caught up near the elevators. "Chair of the Donor Council. For 1 year, you negotiated better terms than most people I hire. I wasn't applying for a job." The elevator doors opened. Laverne stepped inside, then looked back at Richard. "Are you coming, Mr. Whitmore?" He entered and stood opposite Annie. For months, St. Catherine had kept an empty space wherever a donor's voice should have been. At the first council meeting, that space would no longer be empty. Annie would sit there not as Richard's rescuer, not as the hospital's symbol, and not as a grateful young woman invited to complete someone else's story. She would sit there with records, questions, and the authority to make sure silence could no longer be mistaken for consent. 1 year later, Annie crossed the campus of Jefferson Community College with a student identification card clipped to her backpack and an anatomy textbook pressed against her chest. She had finished her morning lab early enough to catch the train to Atlanta for the Donor Council's annual meeting. The ache in her side had not vanished completely. It returned after long shifts, missed meals, or days when she tried to do too much. She had stopped treating it as proof that something was wrong with her. It was part of her medical history, not the definition of her future. Before leaving Birmingham, she stopped at the school cafeteria where Laverne was arranging trays of fruit beneath the serving counter. "You have your water?" Laverne asked. Annie lifted the bottle from her bag. "Food? I packed lunch." "Show me," dit Laverne. "That is not food." Annie opened the bag and revealed a sandwich, an apple, and 2 packets of crackers. Laverne nodded. "Now it is. You know I'm 19. I also know 19-year-olds make decisions as though 20 is guaranteed." Annie leaned across the counter and kissed her cheek. "I'll call when the meeting ends. And do not let those hospital people use 10 words when 1 honest word will do. I'll put that in the official minutes." St. Catherine looked different when Annie entered through the main doors that afternoon. Richard's anniversary portrait had never returned. The old donor poster had been replaced by a display showing recipients and donors only when both had given written permission. No one was identified as anonymous unless that person had confirmed the choice directly. Beside the display stood a notice explaining travel reimbursement, lost wage assistance, counseling, and independent advocacy. The instructions appeared in English and Spanish, with a phone number that did not connect to the transplant department. Annie paused before the wall, not because she trusted it completely, but because every sentence on it could now be checked against a policy that donors had helped write. The council met in a room that had once served as an executive dining area. The long polished table remained, but the portraits of former hospital presidents had been moved to the hallway. 5 former donors sat with Helen Price, Samuel Reed, and a hospital administrator who had no vote. An empty chair near the head of the table had been added for any donor who arrived without advance notice and asked to speak. Annie took her seat as chair. The annual report showed that 41 donors had received travel assistance. 17 had been compensated for lost wages, and 9 had used counseling services. 3 reimbursement requests had taken longer than the required 15 days. The council reviewed each delay by number rather than by name. "That third case waited 32 days, Annie said. "Why?" The administrator checked her notes. A supervisor questioned whether child care qualified as a recovery expense. And, what did the policy say? That reasonable caregiving expenses were covered. Then why was a supervisor allowed to substitute an opinion for the policy? The administrator did not defend the decision. The claim was paid, and the supervisor received additional training. Training is not the same as accountability. No. The delay will be included in the public report. Annie nodded and moved to the next item. Samuel watched from across the table. His role at St. Catherine had changed after the investigation. He no longer supervised donor reporting, but he had accepted a position in the independent follow-up office under the condition that his earlier failures remain part of the official record. Rebecca Sloan had lost her coordinator position for removing documents from the hospital, though the ethics board credited her cooperation and preservation of evidence. She now worked with a nonprofit that taught medical employees how to report misconduct without taking confidential files home. Margaret Vale had been removed from St. Catherine and referred to the State Medical Ethics Board. The board had not revoked her medical license, but it barred her from supervising donor consent programs for 5 years. Her name had also been removed from the hospital's Transplant Leadership Center. Annie had learned that justice rarely arrived as a single punishment. More often, it came through corrected records, restricted authority, public findings, and rules that could no longer be quietly bent. At the end of the meeting, Helen handed her the first printed copy of the annual report. "You should sign it," Helen said. "All council members should. You wrote most of it. That doesn't make it mine." The report passed around the table. Each voting member signed the final page. Annie added her name last. Outside the room, Richard waited near the elevators. He had attended none of the council's private discussions, though the Whitmore Foundation continued funding the independent ethics office through a trust it could not control. "How bad was the meeting?" he asked. "For the hospital?" "Yes. Productive. I've learned that word usually means expensive. Honesty costs less when you practice it early." Richard smiled. "Another lesson I paid for late." They walked through the lobby together. He no longer introduced Annie as the young woman who had saved his life. When someone asked how they knew each other, he said they had met on a train and later worked together on donor reform. The rest belonged to Annie unless she chose to tell it. Richard had become a mentor when she asked for advice about college finances and nonprofit governance, though Annie rejected half his suggestions and questioned the other half until he improved them. At the station, they had 40 minutes before Annie's return train. Richard pointed toward a small cafe across the street. "May I buy you something to drink?" Annie looked at him. "You should be careful with that question. It caused considerable trouble last time. I remember." They took a table near the window. Richard ordered coffee. Annie asked for water. When the server returned, Richard moved the glass toward her without reaching across her space. "How is school?" he asked. "Hard. That wasn't the answer in your last email. In my last email, you asked whether I liked it." "And?" "I do." She showed him her student card. The photograph was unflattering, but her name appeared beneath the words, "Diagnostic Medical Sonography." Richard studied it for a moment. "Your aunt must be proud." She placed a copy on the refrigerator. It covered the electric bill. "A significant promotion." Annie laughed. Across the street, the departure board changed. Her train would begin boarding in 20 minutes. Richard lifted his coffee. "To your first year." Annie raised the glass of water. "No," she said. "To the people who come after us." Richard nodded. "To making certain they are seen." Their glasses touched once. A year earlier, water had been the only thing Richard could offer without knowing who Annie was. Now they understood that gratitude was not measured by what one person could give another. It was measured by whether the truth changed what happened to the next person who entered the room. Annie drank, gathered her bag, and stood when her train was called. This time, she did not leave St. Catherine as an unnamed donor disappearing from someone else's story. She left as Annie Walker, carrying her own future. The story reminds us that gratitude means more than saying thank you. It requires honesty, responsibility, and action. True justice begins when people in power listen to those whose voices have been ignored and use their influence to change unfair systems, not merely solve one person's problem. Annie's courage shows that kindness should never demand silence, and that every act of sacrifice deserves dignity, respect, and lasting protection. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.